Arlemi. I'm a senior developer advocate at Postman. And while my focus is product, we talk a lot about anything API related, Postman being the API platform that covers the whole API lifecycle. I see a few more people joining, so just if you're joining now, I just got started, so it's all good. You didn't miss anything. Welcome to this API First workshop. This session is going to be two parts. The first part, I'm going to make sure that we're all on the same level about what is API First, the things we want to achieve today, and it's going to be slides. And then the second part, I'm going to jump in Postman, and we'll just do things together. So I'll get an API specification, we'll generate different API elements from it, and we do some monitoring, etc. So there's it's going to be a lot of demo. I want it to be more product heavy than just talking about concepts, so you can learn how to do these things. But while there's a few points that I want to do, so showing you how we can validate API specifications, showing you how we can monitor an API, etc. I'm open to like showing you things that you may be interested in as well, as long as it's like related to the API lifecycle. So with that said, let's start with the basics. And the basics is making sure that everyone knows what is API First. So we did a survey last year called the State of the API survey, which you may or may not know, but it's a survey we run every year, and we ask all of the people that are close or not so close of the API world questions around what they know about API, what they do with APIs, etc. And when we asked them to define API First, they came up with that definition that was matching it most what they believe it was. So API First is defining and designing APIs and schemas before beginning development. So what we mean by that is that you need to adopt the best practice approach to your API development process, and it's not as much as a hurdle as you might expect. So you've seen that workshop. We'll start with an open API specification, and that allows you to generate multiple other components, and that delivers reliability and performance. Having that single source of truth being your API definition, that sets your project up for good governance, maintainability, adoption, and ultimately, that should be a competitive advantage. You might know a few companies that are known to be API First. Twitter, for example, they're now for example, their Spaces API, they're full on API First. We have Twilio, which is also an API First company, and there's plenty of others out there. What comes with the API First? So we mentioned, right, before doing anything, you define and design your schema, your source of truth. And once you have that, you can go into the API First workflow, and that is defined as such. So we have the define step at the top, which is what does my API need to do? Who is going to consume my API? But once you have that, you can start designing, documenting, deploying, testing, etc. We're not going to go through all of these steps. We'll try to look at most of them, but just not all of them, because the time might be a bit short. But again, if there's some specific areas that you'd rather see, do drop them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it, and I can look at them while we go through it. So let's talk about the first part, which is defining your specification or API definition. I mentioned we're going to use OpenAPI. A couple of reasons for that. OpenAPI creates a standard vocabulary for describing APIs, and it's a common machine-readable definition. We have other type of specification. You may have heard of RAML, you may have heard of OpenAPI 2, you may have heard of GraphQL, which is more of a schema, but still a way to describe an API. It powers consumer engagement and enterprise infrastructure, being that single thing that everyone talks about, so we can all engage on that OpenAPI. And then you can use that to validate and have some contract testing running between the API producer, but also the API consumers. So with that out of the way, hopefully we're all pretty clear on what OpenAPI is, what API First is, and the API First workflow. So I'm going to jump into the workshop. A couple of things about the workshop. You may follow along. This is, I'll show you where you can get the materials and how you can follow along. Though, because it's a virtual setup, I'm not going to be able to make sure that you're all following up like what I'm doing. So if you're willing to follow along, just make sure that if you're getting too backtracked, just put it to the side, follow what I'm doing, and then you can get back to it later because it's always available online anyway. So we saw during the lecture that there's a few things that we want to do. We want to look at an open API. We want to generate some API elements, documentation, test, etc. And then we want to monitor that collection and see if we can have some tests running on a regular basis. So there's a link here that I'm going to copy and drop in the chat so you can all have it. Just put it here. But another way to find it, if you're already logged into Postman, and that's my Postman. Let me just make sure that you can all see it correctly. Okay, so that should be zoomed in enough, hopefully. And if you've not already seen it, just let me know, and I can zoom in, zoom out. So you can find this this workshop in this Postman Galaxy training. So if you go to the top of Postman and search for Postman Galaxy training, first result will be this workspace. So we can go in there, and we'll open this API tab on the left, look for this customers API, and start from here. One thing that I did not mention, if you actually go through that workshop on your own, whether like while I'm doing it or later on, you actually be able to claim a badge that you can then display on your LinkedIn, on your whichever social network profile you use. So let's get started. We have this API definition already existing, but this one is in the public workspace. So what I've already done, I've created a new workspace for today, which I've called Apidays Interface. So if you're in Postman, you can have a workspace open on the side, and we'll bring that open API to the workspace we've created. So I'm going to look at what they say. I'll create a new API right here. I'll call it customers, version 1. The schema type is going to be OpenAPI 3.0 and YAML. As I mentioned before, you might be familiar with other types of schema types. So there's RAML, OpenAPI 1, 2, 3, 3.1 that we support as well. WSDL, WSDL, really depends how you want to pronounce that one. And recently we've added support for Protobuf. So if you're doing anything with gRPC, this will come in handy as well. So I'll do, and actually we're going to do JSON today. So I create a new API. And now I have kind of the same thing, but for now, it's actually giving me a default OpenAPI spec that doesn't really matches what I want to do. So I'm going to bring this one in, place it here, and save. Cool. First step done. Now I'm in my own workspace, and I can start working on that API specification. As you can see here, I'm on my own, so I'm not going to be pretending that I'm working with other people and that we're collaborating on creating that open API, etc. But here we have an open API that we've already created, and you can see on the left in the different path. It's a customer's API. There's 2 endpoints, a get and a post. So as you can guess, the get endpoint will retrieve detail for a particular customer, and then the post endpoint allows you to add a new customer. So that's a very simple API, and that's what we're going to work out from today. So I'm just going to make sure I'm not missing anything here. Cool. So we can close that one. We won't need this anymore. And here I'm just going to close that so we have more space to see what's happening. Right. So we have an open API. I showed you how you can actually navigate this JSON to see what that API does, but this is not really readable. Let's say you're, again, defining and designing that API with people that may not be familiar with either the business domain or just not familiar with JSON, and it's not very convenient for them to scroll through this and try to understand what this does. we actually generate directly from an API specification documentation that you can also share. So we have the documentation here, the same way you can see the endpoints. So you have the, did I say? So you have the endpoint, you can see them here, and it shows the parameters in a more like friendly manner, and it's not this JSON. And this is schema documentation, as I call it. This is not meant for consumption. This is meant for discussion, where you're in that first step of the API first workflow where you just discuss what you're going to do. Now let's generate documentation that can be consumed by other people. And if you remember when we talked about the API first workflow, I can actually bring it back up here. There's a few steps. There's documenting, deploying, testing, and monitoring. And if you look back at Postman, we have these exact same steps here. So we have documenting, testing, deploying, and monitoring. So we'll go through these different steps and we see what we can do for each of them. So let's start with documentation. I'll click new here and I'll create a new documentation. I'm going to call it customers. There's a few advanced settings based on how you want your documentation to show. You could choose the different parameters generation. So if you want the response to be the response example to use the schema, or to generate based on the schemas. For example, let's say your schema has integer as the type. We're just going to generate a random integer. But if you use schema, we're just going to write integer, and then it's up to the user to know what to put there. You can also choose how you want to organize it, etc. For now, I'm going to leave it to default and create the documentation. So now, if I open back here, I have this customers collection documentation that's here. And hopefully you don't mind if I zoom out once, just so I don't have to like scroll too much. Okay, so I have this collection here. Let me just refresh because I want to make sure it shows in the sidebar as well. Okay, so I have this collection and I can see it here as well. It has one folder with two requests, as I mentioned. So we can see what's being generated. Remember seeing this schema documentation, which was very much just these details. You can just see the parameters, what headers are needed, etc. But it's not actionable. Now we have this collection, which may be more familiar with you if you've ever used Postman. And if I actually open the collection, I now have these requests that I can actually use. So, for example, this one that was generated, I can send and I can already see, oh, I'm getting the customer with this ID, and it's telling me that I could create a customer. But this one is for the API consumer and not the API producer. I lost the chat. Let me just bring it back here. Okay, cool. All right, so it's cool. We've got Open API. We've generated the documentation, but so far we've not really tried to see how Postman is helping with these things. So let's go back to our Open API and try to break things, because that's a good way to see how tools help you. Already here at the bottom, you can see some issues that are found. So there's no errors, that's fine, but there's some warnings. For example, security warnings that tell you, oh, you don't have a security field that is defined. Security being if you need to log in using maybe an API key, or maybe you're not enforcing HTTPS for your API. That's this type of warnings. But let's say, what if I remove version? Now it's telling me there's an error. It's telling me I'm missing a required property version, and it's telling me where. So I can just go back here and put back version. So we have validation of the schema directly, of the API definition here. Another thing we can do is validating the collection against the schema. So now we've just seen how we just make sure that the API definition is valid. but we've generated that collection based on that API definition. So let's go in here. So we have that create customer URL, and let's remove the ID. That is a required field in our API definition. And now if I send this request, I get a little warning here as well that tells me your request body property should have a property ID. So here I can see, and that's what I meant about having some contract testing as well included from the consumer to the producer. Here as a consumer, I know that I'm not in par with what the API definition requires of me. So again, I'll go back here and put it back just to make sure that I comply. And it creates a new customer. Now let's add a new endpoint and see how that reflects. Because here is a one-time generation. So all we've done is we generated one collection. And then what if the API evolves? What happens to the documentation? Does it evolve as well? How does that work? So I'm going to go to my definition and add a new endpoint that's going to do so I'll go in the customer, but instead of a customer endpoint, I'm now going to add a customer's endpoint. So I can see the way I clicked here, so I can see where this closes. So I could also just collapse it and see that it's closing here. So I'm going to add a comma and then add a customer's endpoint. Let's make sure. So what this one does, it gets all of the customers instead of getting a single one. And we can see here, it's using a reference to a schema. So I want to make sure that that schema exists. So I'm going to go down to my schemas here. And I use the left-hand side to navigate there. And I'm going to add a new customer list schema right here. Okay, I saved. I don't have any errors. So let's now see what happens to my documentation. I can actually see it here on the left. Still has two endpoints. So this one is not real time. The schema-based documentation is real time. So for this one, if I refresh, it's real time, but it does require a refresh. I can see I now have a customer path, but I also have a customer's path, which has one request, which is retrieve details for our customers. For this one, the one for documentation, I actually need to validate the collection against the API definition, and it's going to tell me there's some issues found. So I can go in here, review the issues. It's telling me, oh, here's what we found. There's this request, which is an additional request that is not found in the collection. So I can say, yes, add this request to the collection. Then these two that do not match. Let's see what they say. So I'm assuming it's not matching the examples. Select all changes and confirm. So it's updating my collection. Now I can go back to it. And I can see I have customer, but I also have this new request that retrieves details for all the customers. So obviously I'm demoing it at a very small scale where I literally just added a single endpoint. You can imagine how if it was a much bigger project and maybe one of my team is working on that same API and they just added 20 endpoints, this really helps your documentation team not having to rewrite everything. All they have to do is update the collection or update the documentation based on that API definition. Again, that API definition being the source of truth for everything. So now let's move on to the next part of the API lifecycle. So we've done define, designing, even though we kind of went quickly through it. I was not going to spend the whole workshop just writing OpenAPI, documenting. We've got deploying. So deploying, there's different ways you can do that. First, there's the case where you want to deploy a mock version of your APIs, just so your other teams in your company can start working. Maybe your front-end team starts integrating with it. Maybe some other squads, which might be doing something else in the backend, can start seeing how your API would work. So I'll go ahead back to my API, and I'll sure. Okay, so I'll go ahead here and I'll generate a collection, and this time I'll say API mockin. So I'll call it customers mock. The same way we have some advanced settings, but I'll leave it all to default and go ahead to generate my mock server. So I could make the mock server private. I could simulate network delay if I want to have my QA team maybe testing that this API will not break anything if there's a delay. Maybe someone is using that API in a place where internet doesn't work well, etc. So I'll go ahead and create a mock server. And now I have this mock URL, which is a mock server, right? It's not something that's connected to the database, etc. But I could give that URL to any one of you, and you would be able to go in here and say, for example, /customers, and you get a list of customers, which is, because I've used the schema examples at the start, it's just generating this integer, string, etc., query parameters. So I'm ready for that to be used by any other team in my company, or maybe some partners if they want to get some work done already. Now maybe I have my backend team that wants to start actually implementing that API, not as a mock server, but really get started on the implementation. We now have server-side code generation. So if I go back to my OpenAPI again, I can go in here in the code generation part of the right, and I can select which type of language and framework I want to work with. So I typically personally use Node.js. So I can go in here, generate code, and then I'm going to show you quickly. I'm not going to spend so much time on that. Let me just extract it. So it got me this zip file. I've extracted it here, and then I can open that in code. And it's generated me just like the boilerplate of a Node.js application. So I have a server.js file. I have some roots. So I have my customer root, I have my customers root as well. And then in the roots, I also have the implementation here. Obviously, it doesn't do everything. This just handles the routing, etc. But it's up to your developers to implement the business logic, right? Postman doesn't know where this request should go, which type of database you're going to call, etc. It just helps you get started faster with it. So as a developer, instead of like always creating a new project, having to create each root separately, etc., I can generate this boilerplate that helps me get started. So I could go install, and then node server.js, and now I have like a running application again. So if I go back to my browser and I do localhost 2000/customers, I have the same way a local server that runs and that I can start working on to deploy my API. Okay, let's move on to the next step. We have about 25 minutes left, so I want to make sure we cover everything. Testing. So maybe, I'm assuming some of you who are watching already know Postman. Postman started as a testing tool mostly, and it was just for that API testing. It grew into now this like API platform, but testing is still at the heart of Postman. So I'm going to do the same thing I've done for the mock server and the documentation. Go back to my API definition. Remember, that's our source of truth. Everything starts from the API definition. And I generate a new collection. And this one, I'll call it test. So I'll go tests and generate a collection. So now I have my customers test. So I see Rahib in the chat saying he loves the pre and post request script features. We're actually going to do that right now. So one of the things you can do in Postman, you can go at each request level and you can add tests. For example, I want to make sure that all of this endpoint returns a 200. So I can add this test request script and then send it. And now I can see it failed because actually it got me a 201, which is resource credit. So let me change that to 201. Now I can send it and I can see the test passed. So for these other ones, I'm going to do the same thing, but for this one, I want a 200. For this one, I want a 200. And then what if you want to run a test that is the same for all the requests? Instead of going into each of these requests like I just did and adding them, you can actually have a pre-request script and test script at the collection level. So here, I can run a test that's going to be used for all of the requests. And for example, I can say, I want to make sure that all of my endpoints return a response in less than 200 milliseconds. And this test is going to run for each of these requests. So I'm going to now go back to my API, go to the test tab, which is where I can see all of my test suites. And you can see I have this collection that I just created, but there's no runs. I've not run it yet, so there's no data. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to click the Run Test button and run the collection. And I can see that actually 3 tests failed because clearly was too optimistic around like the time it would take for my response to come. They've all taken more than 200 milliseconds, but all of the status codes are a pass. So I'm actually going to come back here and make it 400 this time. And I'll run them again. And I can actually see here the last run results. So if I'm someone from the test team, I have that overview of the test results directly from that view. So let's go ahead and run the test again. So now it all passed. So hopefully, if I come back here, I can see the previous one was 3 out of 6, and now the latest one is 6 out of 6. So yeah, let's move back here. We have the definition, documentation, tests, and if you were, it depends how your component works. You might be using CI/CD, you might be using Jenkins, you might have a CI/CD that does different deployment steps. Instead of doing that manually, you could include that directly in your CI/CD and have these results either stop deployment or maybe just like ping a Slack channel, ping any other integration that will let you know that some tests failed. We've mentioned deployment. So I've mentioned how you can do mock server and how you can like generate server-side code. We actually allow you to deploy directly to AWS, to the AWS API gateway, and we're adding more. We're adding more integration as I speak. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to demo that. If you're familiar with any API gateway, just imagine that you can push your API definition from Postman to the API gateway and then deploy it there. Again, it's not going to guess what your app should do. So you still have to some work to do to like make sure you link each of these API endpoint to maybe a Lambda function, maybe an Azure function, just so there's something that happens afterwards. But you'll have that API gateway taken care of. So now let's move on to the last part, which is monitoring. So we have, so I'm just reading the question from Arlemi in the chat. What is the best way to export the API specs along with contract tests? We have been exploring a use case where the contract plus tests to generate a mock service for a developer portal. So if you're in the case where you want to use them, you want to extract these Postman tests, you don't have to export it. You can export it and then use Newman. So Newman is the Postman collection runner. Let me find you the GitHub. So yeah, we have this thing called Newman. It's a Node.js package that you can run in most of the CI/CD tools out there. So you can either export your collection with the test in there and run it in your pipeline, or from Newman, you can, using your Postman API key, you can log into your Postman account and you can select your collection ID and just run it directly. So the benefit of not exporting the collection every time is that whenever someone updates your tests in Postman, Newman is always going to get like the latest version of the collection. So you don't have to export, make sure you have the latest version in your CI/CD, etc. But Newman would be your answer. I'm putting the link in the chat so you have it as well. Okay, so I mentioned monitoring. We have different types of monitors in Postman. We have uptime monitors, and you might be familiar if you've seen any status page out there. It's just a bunch of green ticks. If something goes wrong, you have a red tick. So that's new. We've just added that recently. But for example, I could go in here, create an uptime monitor, and all these text as a parameter is a URL. So if I do https postman.com, postman check, I can run it at a different frequency in different regions, and then I can just create it. Ooh, I have too many. So I'm not going to be able to show you because I have some in other teams, but you can imagine what it does, right? It's literally just green ticks and red ticks when it goes wrong. What we want to create today is a monitor that's based on the test we've just previously created. So what's a monitor? You've seen me manually run these tests. What a monitor is going to do is going to run these tests at intervals. So let me add a monitor, and I'm going to create a new monitor, and it's going to use an existing collection. So I'm going to use my customer tests. I'll call it customer monitors. I don't have any environment to attach. If I had like a URL, etc., I could add it there, but I don't need that. And then I can choose how often I want to run it. So I'll keep it weekly. So every day at 11 p.m. Same again, I could select the different regions where I want to run it, and I could select where I want to send it. Maybe I have a handle for my QA team, so I could send it there. And I'm going to create the monitor. So now that the monitor is created, same again, you can see there's no runs. I'll run it once. So it's going to run, and then it's coming back to me and tells me, well, the last run worked. And I can actually go in here and see the detail. So here I will be able to click and see all of the requests that happened. I can check the console logs, etc. I can run it multiple times. And it's going to keep on giving me green because my mock server is actually pretty good today. The thing that you may notice now is that there's this connected with here that allows me to integrate with many other tools again. So if I scroll down a bit, I have this list of tools, which you may be familiar with some of them: New Relic, Datadog, OpsGenie, PagerDuty, Slack, etc. So what this means, it means, once again, instead of having people to come into Postman and check what's happening, we want to find your teams where they are. So if you're creating using Slack, I can go in here and say, let me add a Slack integration with that monitor. So I'll make sure that I'm in my test team here, and I'll just post to the general channel. Okay, it's authorized. So now I'll call it customer monitor. I can notify only for failures or for all runs. So I'm going to do all runs. And now I have my integration set up, which means you can see it here. And now whenever I actually call that, let me bring it to the side. This one is my test one. So that's my test Slack one. To the side here. If I run it again, I can open Slack. And actually this one failed, which is good, because now I can see my notification that just arrived on Slack. That tells me 5 out of 6 tests passed. And if I want to see which one failed, I have actually the view here. And it tells me it's the customer endpoint, and it didn't take less than 200 milliseconds. So Slack is an easy example to demonstrate, and that's why I used it. But you can imagine how you could plug that to any other of these observability tools or alert tools. Okay, let's go back to the API first workflow and see what we've seen. So we've done define, design, document. We've talked a bit about deploy, testing, monitoring. I've not really spent a lot of time on secure. I think it's too big of a topic to just be mentioned here. But the last one is discover. So discover is actually what we started with. I mentioned the Postman Galaxy training, how you could find it. So you have this search Postman thing. Any API that you may be looking for example, I mentioned Twitter at the start. If you want to work with the Twitter API, you'll find the public workspace and you can search them here. I mentioned Twilio. If you want to work with the Twilio API, you can find it here and start playing with it. That's one of the ways you can discover things in Postman. There are many other ways. For example, let's say I'm a developer in Postman and I just want to use the Postman actually, let's go to twitter.com. I'm starting to use the Twitter API, and I'm not aware that actually have a collections back and forth, etc. Just because I've used twitter.com here, we actually prompt the related collections. So existing collections, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I can see there's actually a Twitter API v2 that exists, and I can go ahead, fork it, bring it to my workspace, and start working on it. I'm probably missing a few points on discoverability. I don't think that's the very tail end of API first workflow. So don't want to spend too much time here. So let's. I've said many things. I've talked a lot and went through quite a few things pretty fast. So let's roll back to the start and go through everything we've seen. So what did we do? We started from creating a new API. So I was here on the left-hand side, created a new API, and I created this API definition version 3.0. What this does, there was like one path initially with two methods, get and post. Then we added documentation, and we could see we had two types of documentation. So we have, am I actually offline? No, okay. So we have two types of documentation, the schema-backed documentation, and then the API consumer documentation. We saw that we could actually validate the API definition here for errors in the API definition, but we also saw that we could check the validity of requests against the API definition. Then we added a new path, which was /customers, and we updated the documentation based on that. And the way we did it, we came here and validated the documentation here to make sure it was on par with the API definition. We then moved on to talking about deployment. So I showed you how you can create a mock server for other teams to start consuming your APIs and building on top of it while you're still working on it. I showed you how you can generate server-side code. So I need to be in here, and then I can generate server-side code. Oop. Am I actually offline? working right now. Okay. Well, might be a quick internet issue if I'm cutting off. Sorry. So generating server-side code. Then we saw tests, which again is the bread and butter of Postman, which is writing tests against your API, making sure that it returns the right schema in the response. Maybe it's returning the right status code under a certain amount of time. This type of stuff. And then we talked about monitoring, and monitoring based on these tests that we just ran. And again, the monitor is something that runs on a regular basis. And then you can integrate with tons of other software and tools if you want to send that data somewhere else. So let me go back to the slide. If you have any questions before we finish, go for it. We still have about 5 minutes, but otherwise I'm going to move back to here and send the closing remarks. So what we've learned: authoring specs, generating documentation, test suites and mocks, validating things left and right, and then monitoring the API and running the test on a regular basis. One question that I do ask is, are you doing any of these within your team? Do you see any value? There's always these things about API first. Going API first is hard, especially if you already have, if your company already has tons of APIs split around different teams and moving at different pace. So it's going to be hard, but there's tons of benefits coming from it. So you should consider it. And then before I leave, I want to give you a few resources that may be valuable to you. First one is Postman Basecamp. Postman Basecamp is a webinar series that we do every month on a variety of topics. It goes from API security, for example, to API automation, to API lifecycle. So, for example, next week we're doing a session about specifically deploy and monitor. So we're going to spend an hour just showing you how you can do these specific things in very much in detail. And I'll mention that we actually have an in-person Spacecamp coming up in San Francisco in 2 weeks as well, which is going to be a whole day training and very much what I've done today, but with tons more detail and with you doing the work instead of just showing me, watching me do the things. 30 Days of Postman for Developers, which is an online challenge you can do the same way you're getting a badge at the end. It's about 5 minutes a day. I don't know if you're familiar with 100 Days of Code, but it's the same thing in Postman and in 30 days. And if you have any questions, obviously, you've probably seen my Twitter handle here. I'll also be available, I think, throughout the event. So you'd be able to just ping me and I'll answer your questions. But otherwise, go to the community forum. That's where most of the Postman folks are hanging out. So you'd be able to explain your problems and let all your questions known and answered. And last but not least, we have this Postman Answers public workspace where most of the workflows that you may be wondering how to do it in Postman, there's probably an answer there. So let's say you want to know how to make data pass from one request to another and change these requests. There's a collection in there you can just fork that shows you exactly how to do that. So with that said, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So once again, I'll be around. Feel free to ping me directly through Open or on Twitter. And otherwise, thank you for attending. Hopefully you've learned some stuff. And I'll hopefully see you at another event.